All right, folks, good morning. Here we are again. We're going to go ahead and start chapter 2, the spread of civilization. In particular, what we're going to be looking at is the rise of Egypt. Now, there's a reason why we want to start to look at Egypt. As we talked about before, all life, according to the out of Africa theory, started in Africa and spread from there. And now, obviously, Egypt is in Africa, so it's going to be one of the closest civilizations to begin to rise as man begins to spread. Here's why we want to look at Egypt. Egypt is, like Mesopotamia, was one of the first river valley civilizations. Ancient Egyptian history included three long periods of stability and achievement, interspersed with shorter periods of political disorder. So we'll take a look at the Egyptian kingdom, how it developed. Obviously, its religion. Religion is part of any civilization. We'll look at the geography a little bit, and we'll look at some other things that made the Egyptian kingdom great for its time. Here's our bell ringer. We're going to talk about ideograms real quickly. An ideogram is a picture that stands for an ideal or meaning. One system of writing that used ideograms was ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Egyptian ideograms were often pictures that resembled what they represented. For example, the Egyptian ideogram for walking looked like walking legs. Now, I look at ideograms like emojis, okay? So actually, there's a walking emoji in most of your phones, which I find pretty funny, that the ideogram for walking was walking legs, and we use the same thing today as an emoji or a modern day ideogram. So here is a question for you. Below is an ancient Egyptian ideogram. What do you think it might stand for? All right, so it's a circle, and I'm looking at this thing, and obviously the first thing you're going to say, it's a donut. Well, they didn't have donuts back then, so let's look at something else. Take a few seconds, pause the video, and while you pause it, I want you to think about what was important to the ancient Egyptians. What was part of their life that would have required or something that they would have wanted an ideogram for. Take a few seconds, and when we come back, we'll discuss it. Okay, so if you thought about it for a little bit, this is actually the Egyptian ideogram for the sun. Okay, and obviously the sun was very important to them. They worshipped a sun god. So, of course, they would have had an ideogram to represent one of their most important ideals. We see ideograms all the time in our life. Think about, for instance, on the doors of restrooms in public places. A lot of times, instead of writing men or women on the door, they just put an ideogram. They'll put a figure with a skirt on, signifying a woman, and they'll put a figure with pants or no lower body covering. Actually, just looks like a pair of legs, and they'll signify that for male. Ideograms are recognizable. They're images that are used to convey ideals rather than symbols used to represent speech sounds. So even if you can't read the language, if you're in a foreign country, an ideogram can almost be universal, and anyone can read that. So that's why they use ideograms. So now that we know what an ideogram is, let's see if we can figure out an ideogram for ourselves. All right, so what do you think the Egyptian ideogram is for a house? We've seen what it is for sun. We discussed legs, men's and women's signs. What do you think it might be for a house? Take a few minutes and sketch one on your notepad somewhere and see what you might come up with. Pause the video, and when you come back, we'll discuss it. Okay, so we're looking at what do we think an ideogram for a house might be. Here it is. It doesn't look quite like probably the house you drew, and maybe it does, but it has the essential elements. It does have four walls, right? It does have an opening in that wall. Now, our modern house that we drew, our house ideogram probably had a pitched roof on it, a roof that was angled triangular. That is because we need roofs of that shape for rain runoff and for definitely snow fall off and leaf fall off. But we're in Egypt. There's no snow. There's not a lot of trees. There's probably zero trees. So there's no leaves that need to be pitched for a roof to be pitched for the leaves to flow down a roof. So they had flat roofs. Now, and they did not get a ton of rain, so they didn't have to worry about the water weight on top of their roof and their roof being flat for that purpose. But now we can see pretty much how ideograms differ from the letters of an alphabet. They don't represent a sound to make up each word. It's an ideal. So you would have had to have an ideogram for everything. All right, the next thing we want to do is we want to understand the significance of geography to Egypt's development. Okay, so there is a huge significance to the way that Egypt developed due to its geography, obviously. We've talked about the Nile some. Because of its length, the Nile River provided a natural route for transportation and obviously communication. Farmers counted on yearly flooding of the Nile to replenish the soil that provided a surplus of food. And we've talked about that. We've talked about the flooding and the silt in the lower Egypt and the Nile Delta. It also offered natural protection. You've got deserts to the west and east, the Red Sea to the east, the Mediterranean Sea to the north, and rapids on the Nile provided natural barriers against invasion. And obviously this was part of their religion. Numerous gods were associated with the heavenly bodies and natural forces that gave early Egyptians a sense of security and timelessness. So basically what we're talking about is the geography and religion. They worshipped the gods of the rains and of the Nile itself because it was their life force. It's literally their oasis in the desert. They were not able to stray very far from the Nile and its resources because it is what gave rise to their civilization. So their geography and because of it, their religious beliefs came directly from the Nile and its surrounding geography. So here we want to take a look at the actual workings of the Nile. As we see in green, that's our fertile land, the black land from the silt. Our triangular shapes are pyramids, our squares are temples. We have our capitals and other cities. Now, remember, the Nile flows from south to north. Okay, it flows down the mountains in Central Africa to the Mediterranean Sea. It doesn't flow north to south like our mountains, like our rivers do here in America. Every year, yearly floods deposited rich soil along the river. This enabled farmers to grow more grain than people needed to live. As a result, cereal grains were Egypt's chief export. The ancient Egyptian god Nun, father of the sun god, was long revered as a source of the annual floods. All right, so there we see again their religion, their gods that they've created are explaining their natural environment, the world around them that they did not have answers for. So let's talk about how they actually used the Nile for travel. Traveling downriver or to the north was relatively easy for the ancient Egyptians. The Nile's current moved in that direction, so a ship in the river was naturally carried northward. Traveling upriver or to the south was a more difficult task. Even powerful strokes with an oar could not carry a vessel very far against the current. Instead, the Egyptians built sails to take advantage of the power of the wind. Again, remember I said necessity is the mother of all invention. There was a necessary for sails to be invented, and so they did so. So we're already seeing the innovativeness of these ancient Egyptians. Let's take a look now at key features of Egyptian religion. Egyptians considered religion to be essential to every part of their lives, and so there was no word for religion in the Egyptian language. Now, I think I told you this in the last section. I got ahead of myself a little bit looking forward. I told you that it was the Mesopotamian society. That's my fault. I got a little bit ahead of myself as I was getting ready for this lecture. But it was the Egyptians that had no word for religion in their language. It was just such a big part of their lives. Egyptians were polytheistic. Obviously, they believed in many gods. There was a god for every situation to explain natural events in their lives. Gods and goddesses were associated with heavenly bodies and natural forces. Because of the importance of the sun and fertile lands along the Nile, sun and land gods and goddesses held special significance. Obviously, because these are the gods of the resources that they really, really need to survive on a day in and overall, throughout their whole civilization, they needed these resources, so they held a special significance. The Egyptian ruler took the title Son of Ra and was considered an earthly form of Ra, one of the sun god's names. Pharaohs were mummified so that their bodies would be preserved for life in the next world. So we actually see a development of a belief in an afterlife now. It's not just these gods are here to help them on earth. They actually are believing now in higher powers that can get you to an afterlife. So this is actual more development that we'll see in modern religion. So let's now talk about one of their gods. Here's Horus. We'll start from left to right and work counterclockwise. So Horus is sometimes shown wearing this double crown. The two prongs of the crown symbolize Upper and Lower Egypt, which joined together to form a unified kingdom in about 3100 BC. In Egyptian tradition, Horus's eyes represented the sun and the moon. Horus was the archenemy of another god, Set or Seth. Images of Horus sometimes show him killing crocodiles and other animals believed to be sacred to Set. Horus's name is related to Egyptian words meaning shiny-faced. So this is just one of their gods that they worship. Again, his name is Horus, and it just shows you how there was a backstory, how there's a full, rich narrative to their religion. It's not just something that they threw together. It developed over time. Let's do a little food for thought. So what are some geographic advantages to Egypt's location? Let's think about that. We talked about that in the bell ringer. What are some geographic advantages to Egypt's location? Obviously, the Nile is right there. We talked about how the desert and the river offer protection. We also talk about how it's the only fertile place in the area. So this geographic advantages are definitely due to its location. Why might the Egyptian people have thought of the Nile River in religious terms? We discussed that a little bit as well. The Nile was their source of life. It is what gave rise to their civilization. If it wasn't for the Nile, the rich fertile that it brought, the water that they could drink, there would not have been a civilization. So therefore, we can see why it was thought of in religious terms. It was almost actually like a god. It was the giver of life for them. Let's talk now about the Egyptian kingdoms. We want to look at what characterizes the divisions in the first two major periods in Egypt's history. There's these major periods, and we want to look at exactly what they had in store for us. All right, so we want to look at Egypt's history. It's divided into three major periods. There's the Old Kingdom. It was a prosperous age of pyramids, and the Middle Kingdom was a golden age of stability. All right, and then there's the New Kingdom, and we'll talk about that later. But right now, we want to talk about these two major periods, the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom. So let's talk about the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom was an age of prosperity and unity, lasting from about 2700 to 2200 BC. Divine kingship during the Old Kingdom was established. Pharaohs, they ruled with absolute power. A bureaucracy was developed. Eventually, Egypt was divided into provinces run by governors appointed by the pharaoh. So we actually see a government start to arise, as we talked about how part of the downside of civilization is you now have new needs for government, maybe even law enforcement, things like that. Pyramids were built as tombs for the mummified bodies of the pharaohs. And all this took place during the Old Kingdom. So whenever you see pyramids and think about those things, you think about pharaohs, this all came to rise during the Old Kingdom. Now let's take a look at the Middle Kingdom. Egypt expanded during the Middle Kingdom. This lasted from 2055 to 1650 BC. So this is a pretty lengthy period of roughly 400 years. Egypt conquered Nubia to the south. They also sent military personnel to protect its expanded territory. So now, as we talked about before, when you expand, you're going to need some sort of law enforcement. You have all these people under your control. How do you enforce these laws? How do you protect your territory? Traders traveled to Kush. They also traveled to Syria, Mesopotamia, and Crete. And when this happens, we talked about the intermingling of different cultures and different societies, and how different peoples will take different things from each one, and societies will begin to mix. Let's talk about the Egyptian pyramids a little bit. So this first one on the left is called a mastaba. They were the earliest Egyptian tombs. Early mastabas were made of mud brick, and later ones were made out of stone. When workers began the step pyramid of Pharaoh Dozier, it was meant to be a mastaba, but it became stone pyramid with 6 steps. So this is the evolution of the actual pyramid. They weren't sure how to build these things right off the bat, and they evolved from mastabas to these step pyramids, and to finally what we have on the far right, the Great Pyramid. It was the largest pyramid ever constructed and was built for Pharaoh Khufu. Now, pyramids are such cool structures. I've got great video that we're going to watch as a class on ancient Egyptian engineering. It's an older video, but I think it really depicts just how innovative, how smart these Egyptians were, and the massive scale of these structures that they built. All right, next we want to talk about Egyptian social structure. How was Egyptian society organized? Well, it was highly structured. This wasn't just something they threw together. This was something that took some planning and some thought. The pharaoh was at the top of the social order in ancient Egypt. He was the absolute ruler. What he said goes. He was also thought to be divine. He was given his power from the gods. So therefore, he could not be questioned. We'll also see this in other ancient societies, that their leaders were given their power by the gods. The nobles and priests who surrounded the pharaoh, these were the upper class. So basically his entourage, his inner circle of people that weren't not necessarily on his level equally, but they were his peoples, his priests and the people who surrounded him. Below the upper class were merchants, artisans, or if you're fancy, artisans, scribes, and tax collectors. So these people made up the upper class, or I'm sorry, the middle class. Then you have the lower classes. They were the largest group of people in Egypt. Most were peasants. They lived in small villages. They paid taxes and were forced to provide military service and labor for building projects. This is something that we'll see throughout our study of societies and cultures, civilizations, and world history. The largest class of people who make the least amount of money, they were the only ones who were forced to pay taxes into the government. If this doesn't balance out, this is where we start to get revolutions throughout society. And like I've been saying, the French Revolution is one of the most amazing revolutions we'll see. We'll also see the Mexican Revolution. It was fun as well. So we got to be aware of our pyramidical structure and how we treat our classes. Egyptian society was basically patriarchal, which means it was man-driven. But women could inherit property, they could operate businesses, and also become priestesses. A few even become pharaohs. Now we think a lot of our few pharaohs who were actually women, but it's funny because they would actually wear false beards, mustaches, eyebrows and things to look more masculine, to show that they have control of their empire. But this was very innovative at the time. Women weren't always held in high regard, especially and throughout history in general. But we see that they trusted the female sex to be their pharaohs and to run their countries. And this is something that I hope more countries realize today, is that it's equal and that man or woman can run a country. And they did this back then. They much more forward thinking than even we are today in some of our societies. All right, so let's analyze a primary source. Now remember, a primary source is something that comes from the period. Egypt developed a sophisticated educational system. Though it was generally only available for the sons of the elite, from a very young age, youths were taught reading, writing, medicine, mathematics, and science. Many went on to become scribes and serve the state. Others became priests, overseeing the rituals that gave order to Egyptian society. Whatever path the students were bound for, Egyptian schools were not creative environments, but places that stressed rote memorization and a strict adherence to tradition. This is an excerpt, a piece of a book from Margaret A. Murray, from the book that was called The Splendor That Was Egypt, written in 2004. The education of children, especially of the boys, was considered to be of great importance. They appear to have been sent to boarding school at the age of 4. The subjects taught at the school were chiefly reading, writing, and arithmetic. Great pains were taken that the boys should be well trained, as they were all being educated to be clerks in government offices or priests or artists. Reading and writing were essential for these three professions, and for the government service, arithmetic was of great practical value, an account of the complicated system of taxation. So here we see how they educated the men, the young boys in their system. Our question is, how did Egyptian education reflect Egyptian social structure? Take a few minutes to think about that, pause it, and we'll talk about it when you get back. All right, so our question is, how did Egyptian education reflect Egyptian social structure? Well, obviously the social structure was patriarchal. They put the boys and young men on a different level. They were allowed or looked for to carry the society, and therefore that's who they educated. They did not educate the girls nearly as much because they looked towards the men to be the heads and to run their country. So their educational system reflected how their actual social structure was set up. Let's take a look now at Egyptian accomplishments. The hieroglyphic writing system, in which pictures and abstract symbols were used to communicate meaning, was developed in about 3000 BC. The hieratic script, which was a simplified form of hieroglyphics, was used in business and everyday communications. Architectural achievements included pyramids, temples, and other monuments. Sculpture followed particular formulas, as in the representation of the human body from multiple perspectives. Okay, so what this means is how they actually depicted via sculpture the human form. Was it directly proportionate to the way the human form was in real life, or did they do this from different perspectives? If you look, sometimes the heads are larger than the bodies. It's not proportionate, but that was the way that they viewed their world. Advances in mathematics aided in the construction of Egypt's massive monuments. There was a lot of trigonometry used, obviously, and geometry used in the building of these massive structures, the Sphinx, the Great Pyramids, all these things that they built. They didn't just throw it together. There was a lot of thought that went into this, a lot of mathematics. The Egyptians also created an accurate 365-day calendar. So we see just how innovative these people were. So let's wrap it up. Let's review. Chapter 2, Lesson 1, the Rise of Egypt. So an ideogram is a picture that stands for an ideal or meaning. One system of writing that used ideograms was ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. Egyptian ideograms were often pictures that resembled what they represented. Egyptians considered religion to be essential to every part of their lives, and so there was no word for religion in the Egyptian language. Egyptians were polytheistic. They believed in many gods. During the Old Kingdom, pyramids were built as tombs for the mummified bodies of the pharaohs. Now that we're done with that, please don't forget, you still have your GRA to do. You have a quiz over the next section. Please always keep up with your guided reading, with your vocab activity that covers the whole chapter. Jump in there and add words to our glossary. Those are good to study for later. As always, read. Read your book. Read the section. Don't just come in here and watch the videos and expect to get everything. This is just a summary of what you need to be reading out of the book for section 1. Also, we'll have our discussions over the next few sections coming up in a few days, so be ready for that. I will post those questions and get you ready just like we did last time. If there's no other questions that you have of me, remember, you can always hit me on the Q&A board. You can always email me if you have any questions. Don't be afraid to ask. That's what I'm here for. Hope you all have a good day. See you tomorrow.